Ethan Caldwell, the billionaire founder of Caldwell Airways, decided to go undercover to experience his airline the way his customers did. Trading in his luxury suite for an economy seat, he boarded the flight unnoticed, blending seamlessly into the crowd. But just as he settled into his seat, a quiet conversation behind him stopped him cold. Two passengers, one a young woman clutching her phone with trembling hands. The other an older man fumbling with customs forms caught his attention. Their words painted a picture of desperation and grief. The woman was racing to reach her father, who had just suffered a stroke. The older man, a retired firefighter, was flying alone for the first time since losing his wife. Both were struggling, but no one around them seemed to care. What happened next changed everything. A compassionate flight attendant stepped in to help, but her kindness drew criticism from a senior colleague, exposing a culture of indifference that went against everything Ethan believed in. What Ethan witnessed on that flight set off a chain of events that shook his airline to its core and proved that leadership is about more than just sitting at the top. Stay tuned. This is a story of courage, accountability, and the power of one person to make a difference. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from and if you believe kindness can transform lives. This is a story you don't want to miss. The airport terminal was alive with the usual chaos of humanity in transit, children crying, announcements echoing overhead, and the ceaseless hum of rolling suitcases on polished floors. Elijah Morrison stood amidst it all, blending seamlessly into the crowd. Dressed in a simple gray sweatshirt and jeans, his commanding presence was muted by choice, his sharp gaze the only hint of his authority. He was no stranger to the polished interiors of private jets or the velvet-roped sanctuaries of first-class lounges. Yet here he was, boarding a crowded economy flight on Morrison Airways, the airline he had built from scratch. For years, whispers had reached his ears. Complaints about inattentive service, rumors of employees feeling unheard, and a culture that seemed to reward those who conformed rather than those who excelled. But what troubled him most were the subtle echoes of something more insidious, a quiet undercurrent of favoritism, of exclusion, of a systemic rot hiding behind the gleaming facade of corporate success. Elijah had learned long ago that the truth was rarely found in polished boardrooms. It lived in the hushed conversations of ordinary people, in their eyes when they thought no one was looking. As the plane began boarding, Elijah tightened the straps of his worn backpack. His ticket, purchased under the name Eli Matthews, assigned him a cramped middle seat in row 18. He settled in, greeted by the faint scent of recycled air and the persistent chatter of passengers arranging their carry-ons. To his right sat an older man, his weathered hands clutching a tattered photograph. To his left, a young woman stared blankly at her phone, her face pale and her eyes red from crying. The flight attendant's voice crackled through the intercom, instructing passengers to fasten their seatbelts. Elijah glanced at the woman beside him. She was trembling, her hands gripping the armrests as if they were the only things tethering her to the earth. "First time flying?" he asked, his tone casual. She flinched slightly before shaking her head. "No," she whispered, "but I wish I weren't here." Her name, he would later learn, was Clara Bennett. Her father had suffered a stroke earlier that morning, and she was racing against time to reach the hospital. Every minute of delay, every bump of turbulence, felt like an affront to her desperation. Across the aisle sat Samuel Torres, a retired firefighter who fumbled with the customs forms on his tray table. His wife, he muttered to no one in particular, had always handled these things. She had passed away just months earlier, and this was his first flight without her. Elijah's chest tightened as he observed them. These were the people his airline was supposed to serve, people carrying invisible weights, navigating their private storms. Yet as he looked around the cabin, he noticed the indifference of his staff. A flight attendant walked briskly by, her gaze fixed forward, ignoring Clara's trembling hands. Samuel hesitated before raising his hand for assistance, only to be met with a curt nod and a rushed explanation he clearly couldn't follow. Then came Marianne Porter. She moved through the aisle like a steady current, her presence calm but commanding. Her uniform was crisp, but her smile was what softened the room. When she stopped at row 18, the shift was palpable. "Ma'am," she said gently, crouching beside Clara's seat, "you look like you've had a rough morning. Is there anything I can get you?" Clara blinked, her walls cracking under the weight of Marianne's sincerity. "It's my dad," she managed. "He's in the hospital. I need to get there." Marianne didn't rush her. She nodded, her eyes never leaving Clarice, and after a moment, she placed a hand lightly on her shoulder. "I'll do everything I can to make this flight easier for you." She turned to Samuel next. Noticing his fumbling hands, "These forms can be tricky," she said with a warm chuckle. "Mind if I walk you through it?" The man looked at her, his eyes filling with gratitude, and nodded. For a moment, Elijah felt hope. This was the kind of service he had envisioned when he built Morrison Airways, a place where care transcended obligation, where passengers felt seen. But hope was fleeting. A sharp voice cut through the fragile warmth. Marianne, Rebecca Stanton, the senior flight attendant, approached with brisk, clipped steps. Her face was a mask of disapproval. "We don't have time to babysit every passenger. You need to focus on efficiency." Marianne straightened, her hands folding neatly in front of her. "I was just helping." Rebecca's eyes narrowed. "And that's why you're still in the same position after 10 years. If you ever want to move up in this company, you need to stop wasting time on sob stories." The words hung in the air, cruel and unyielding. Clara sank deeper into her seat. Samuel turned away, and Marianne's composure cracked just enough for Elijah to notice the flicker of frustration in her eyes. Elijah's fists clenched under his tray table. This wasn't just a matter of poor management, it was something deeper. Something systemic. The indifference, the disdain, the unspoken hierarchy that punished empathy and rewarded compliance, it all pointed to a culture that had lost its way. As the plane took off, Elijah's resolve hardened. He had boarded this flight to uncover the truth. Now, the truth stared back at him with chilling clarity. The challenges ahead were greater than he had imagined. But one thing was certain. He would not allow this toxic culture to persist. Not in a company bearing his name. Unseen by those around him, Elijah gazed out the window. The horizon stretching endlessly before him. The flight had just begun. And so had his battle. If you believe in treating everyone with dignity, fairness, and compassion just like our undercover CEO did, press 1 to show your support for doing what's right. Even when it's not easy. The hum of the engines was steady. A monotonous backdrop to the soft murmur of passengers chatting, the occasional chime of the call button, and the rustle of in-flight magazines. For most people, this flight was just another ordinary journey, a few hours of discomfort, followed by arrival at their destination. But for Elijah Morrison, seated quietly in row 18, it was becoming something far more significant. He had come seeking answers, but now he felt the weight of something larger, something uglier, coiling beneath the surface. Marianne Porter's kindness had been a balm to passengers like Clara Bennett and Samuel Torres. But it had also become a lightning rod for disdain from her colleagues. Elijah watched as Rebecca Stanton, the senior flight attendant, threw subtle but barbed glances in Marianne's direction. Each time Marianne lingered too long helping a passenger, Rebecca's disapproval grew more pronounced. Her whispered comments to another flight attendant punctuated by sharp nods in Marianne's direction. Elijah was no stranger to this kind of dynamic. He had seen it before, not just in workplaces, but in neighborhoods, schools, and churches. The quiet undermining of someone who didn't conform to the unspoken rules of power. It was the same force that had shaped much of his own childhood. Where excellence was met with suspicion and kindness with contempt. It was a pattern woven into the fabric of a society that valued the illusion of progress while quietly punishing those who didn't play the game. As the flight attendants prepared to serve drinks, the tension in the cabin began to rise. Rebecca took the lead, her smile tight and forced as she breezed through the aisles, offering perfunctory greetings to passengers in first class before moving briskly to economy. Marianne followed a few steps behind, her demeanor warm and unhurried, her tray held steady as she paused to make genuine connections. When she reached row 18, Marianne crouched slightly to meet Clara's eyes. "Would you like some tea? It might help calm your nerves." Clara hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you." Marianne returned a moment later with a steaming cup and a soft smile. "Here you go, no charge." Clara's gratitude was palpable, but the act did not go unnoticed. Rebecca, now standing 2 rows ahead, turned sharply. "Marianne," she called, her tone clipped. "A word, please." The cabin seemed to hold its breath as Marianne approached. The 2 women stood just beyond earshot of the passengers. but their body language spoke volumes. Rebecca's rigid stance, her pointed finger, the narrowing of her eyes, all of it conveyed reprimand. Marianne's head tilted slightly, her calm composure unshaken, but Elijah could see the tension in her shoulders. When Marianne returned to the aisle, there was no trace of the exchange in her expression. She resumed her duties, assisting Samuel with his forms and chatting briefly with a family traveling with a fussy toddler. Yet Elijah could feel the weight of Rebecca's gaze following her, scrutinizing her every move. The true breaking point came halfway through the flight. A young black man seated a few rows ahead called for assistance. His seatbelt was stuck, and he needed help adjusting it. Marianne was the first to respond, her approach calm and professional. But as she crouched to assist, Rebecca intervened. "I'll handle this," Rebecca said sharply, stepping between them. Marianne blinked. "I've got it under control." Rebecca's tone hardened. "I said, I'll handle it." The man in the seat looked between them, his expression shifting from confusion to discomfort. "It's fine," he muttered. "I just need." Rebecca cut him off, her voice firm. "You should have flagged us earlier. Now you're holding up the cabin." Elijah's stomach turned. The man's shoulders stiffened, his face flushing with a mix of embarrassment and anger. Marianne stepped back, her lips pressed into a thin line, but her eyes remained fixed on Rebecca, a quiet defiance flickering in their depths. The moment passed quickly. Rebecca adjusted the seatbelt and moved on, but the damage was done. Elijah watched as the man slouched in his seat, avoiding eye contact with anyone around him. He had seen this play out countless times before, the subtle exercise of power, the quiet humiliation. The message sent loud and clear that some people were less deserving of respect. When Marianne walked by again, Elijah reached out, catching her attention. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. She hesitated, then nodded. "It's nothing I'm not used to," she said, her voice low but steady. "You just learn to keep your head down." Elijah's jaw tightened. He had heard those words before, spoken by his mother when she came home from cleaning houses, by his father when he talked about navigating the factory floor. Keep your head down, don't make waves, survive. But survival wasn't enough, not anymore. As the plane began its descent, the tension in the cabin was almost tangible. Marianne continued to work quietly, her small acts of kindness defying the oppressive atmosphere Rebecca seemed determined to enforce. Elijah felt a simmering anger rising within him, not just at Rebecca's behavior, but at the system that had allowed it to fester. When the wheels touched down and the plane taxied to the gate, Elijah knew one thing for certain: this was no longer just a flight. It was a battlefield, and he was determined to fight for those who had been silenced for too long. As he gathered his belongings and prepared to disembark, Elijah cast one last look at Marianne. She was standing at the front of the cabin, her smile still intact but her eyes heavy with the weight of what she had endured. He nodded to her, a silent promise that change was coming. The storm was brewing, and Elijah Morrison was ready to face it. If you believe in treating everyone with dignity, fairness, and compassion just like our undercover CEO did, press 1 to show your support for doing what's right, even when it's not easy. Elijah Morrison strode through the terminal with measured steps, his senses still attuned to the echoes of the flight he had just endured. The fluorescent lights reflected off polished floors, and the murmur of arriving passengers blended with the announcements overhead. Yet beneath the surface, an invisible current of unease simmered within him, a knowing tension born of years spent recognizing the quiet indignities of the world. He had seen enough during the flight to confirm his suspicions. His airline was not the equitable haven he had once envisioned. No, it had become something else, something corrupted, where silent hierarchies thrived, and people like Marianne Porter were ground down by forces they could neither name nor combat. Elijah's destination was Morrison Airways' towering headquarters, its glass facade gleaming against the city skyline like a monument to success. But as he entered the building, he felt none of the pride that had once accompanied him here. Instead, he was bracing himself for a confrontation not just with individuals, but with a culture that had strayed far from its founding ideals. The elevator hummed softly as it ascended to the executive floor. Elijah's reflection stared back at him from the mirrored walls, sharp features, graying temples, and eyes that had seen too much of the world's inequities to be easily deceived. When the doors slid open, he stepped into the marble-lined hallway leading to his office. his mind already formulating the questions he would need to ask. He didn't make it to his desk. Linda, his assistant, intercepted him, her face pinched with concern. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice low, "you need to see this." She handed him a tablet, the screen displaying an internal memo. Elijah's eyes scanned the text, his expression darkening with each line. The memo detailed a staffing strategy in which promotions were determined by an opaque rubric, one that, in practice, excluded individuals deemed unfit for leadership. The criteria were vague, but the implications were not. It was a thinly veiled system of favoritism, perpetuated by senior staff under the guise of corporate efficiency. Elijah's hands tightened around the tablet. "Who signed off on this?" he asked, his voice quiet but dangerous. "Rebecca Stanton and several others," Linda replied, "but it's more than just her. There's a whole network of them, people who've been protecting each other for years." Elijah exhaled slowly, the weight of the revelation settling on his shoulders. He had built Morrison Airways on the promise of integrity. Yet here was proof that integrity had been sacrificed for convenience. And worse, the people being silenced were those who didn't fit the mold, people like Marianne, whose compassion and individuality were seen as liabilities rather than strengths. "Get me the files on every promotion decision in the last 5 years," he said finally, "and pull Marianne Porter's personnel record. I want to see everything. Blank. Blank. Hours later, Elijah sat in his office, surrounded by stacks of documents and glowing screens. The deeper he dug, the more damning the evidence became. Marianne's record stood out like a beacon of injustice. Her performance reviews were stellar, with countless glowing testimonials from passengers and colleagues alike. Yet every application she had submitted for a leadership role had been rejected, often by Rebecca Stanton or others in her circle. What disturbed Elijah most were the notes attached to Marianne's file. "Too soft. Lacks authority. Unfit for leadership." The words were echoes of a language he had known his whole life. One used to diminish and exclude those who didn't conform to a narrow ideal. The final straw came when he discovered discrepancies in the records. Marianne's most recent performance reviews were missing entirely, erased from the system without explanation. Elijah leaned back in his chair, his jaw clenched. This wasn't just favoritism, it was sabotage. Blank. Elijah didn't sleep that night. Instead, he spent the early hours reviewing the company's policies and drafting a plan. By dawn, his path was clear. He had always believed in leading by example. But now he realized that example wasn't enough. Action was required, bold, decisive action. At 9 a.m., he summoned the leadership team to an emergency meeting. The conference room was filled with senior executives, HR personnel, and department heads, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. Rebecca Stanton sat near the center of the table, her posture as rigid as ever, her gaze defiant. Elijah entered the room with deliberate steps, a file folder in his hand. He placed it on the table and surveyed the group, his silence commanding their attention. "I took a flight yesterday," he began, his voice calm but firm. "An unannounced, undercover flight in economy class. What I witnessed confirmed something I've been hearing for months, that our company culture is broken." Rebecca shifted in her seat. "With all due respect, Mr. Morrison, I don't see how." "You don't see because you're part of the problem," Elijah interrupted, his tone sharp. The room fell silent. "I've reviewed the records, the promotions you've approved, the ones you've blocked, the culture you've cultivated. It's not just unethical, it's unacceptable." He opened the folder, pulling out documents and laying them on the table. Marianne Porter, 10 years of exemplary service, countless testimonials from passengers, consistently high performance. And yet, every promotion she's applied for has been denied. Why? Rebecca opened her mouth, but Elijah didn't give her the chance to respond. Because she's too soft. Because she doesn't fit your narrow idea of what a leader should be. Or is it because she reminds you of the people you've spent your life ignoring? The words hung heavy in the air. Elijah turned to the HR director. "And you let it happen. You signed off on their decisions without question. You allowed this culture to thrive." The HR director paled, stammering something incoherent. Elijah ignored her. He turned to the group at large. "This ends today," he said, his voice rising. "We're launching a full audit of every promotion decision made in the last 5 years. Anyone found guilty of favoritism, discrimination, or sabotage will be held accountable. He paused, his gaze settling on Rebecca. As for you, you're fired. Effective immediately. Rebecca's face flushed with shock and anger. You can't. I just did, Elijah said, his tone final. He turned to the rest of the room. This company was built on the promise of integrity and service. If we can't uphold those values, then we don't deserve the trust of our employees or our customers. Change starts now. As the meeting ended, Elijah felt a flicker of hope. The fight was far from over. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was taking the first real step toward reclaiming the soul of Morrison Airways. The day after the explosive meeting, Elijah Morrison sat in his office, watching the morning light streak through the glass walls of his skyscraper. Below, the city hummed with life cars honking, people rushing to jobs they hated or hoped would someday fulfill them. The world moved on, indifferent to the tremors shaking the foundation of Morrison Airways. Yet Elijah felt the weight of those tremors pressing down on him. He had always believed in the idea of fairness. It was a belief shaped not by the privileged halls of corporate America but by the uneven sidewalks of his childhood, where fairness was scarce and survival often depended on bending. Yet now, in this gleaming tower of power and influence, he saw how easily fairness could be manipulated, diluted, and discarded. The door to his office opened softly, and Linda stepped in. You've got visitors, she said, her voice low. They're from HR, and they're not happy. Elijah nodded. Send them in. Two figures entered. Denise Harding, the HR director whose complicity he had exposed yesterday, and Charles Wexley, a senior executive with a reputation for playing politics. Their faces carried the tight-lipped smiles of people used to masking discomfort with professionalism. Elijah, Denise began, settling into a chair across from him. We need to discuss the fallout from yesterday's meeting. Fallout? Elijah's tone was sharp. You mean accountability? Charles leaned forward, his expression measured. Let's not get caught up in semantics. Rebecca's dismissal has raised concerns among senior staff. They're worried about the precedent this sets. The precedent it sets, Elijah replied, his voice rising, is that corruption won't be tolerated. If that's a problem for senior staff, they're welcome to leave. Denise shifted in her seat, exchanging a glance with Charles. It's not that simple, she said. People are saying this is a personal vendetta, that you're targeting individuals rather than addressing systemic issues. Elijah laughed, a cold, humorless sound. Systemic issues don't happen in a vacuum, Denise. They're created and perpetuated by individuals like Rebecca. Like you. Denise's face tightened, but she said nothing. The truth is, Elijah continued, you've allowed a toxic culture to fester because it benefited you. It gave you power, control, but now that power is crumbling, and you're scrambling to protect it. Charles cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the conversation. Elijah, we understand your concerns, but radical changes could destabilize the company. Investors don't like instability. Investors don't like corruption either. Elijah countered, and if they knew how much talent we've lost because of people like Rebecca, they'd be furious. The room was tense, the air thick with unspoken accusations and simmering resentment. Elijah could feel the battle lines being drawn, the quiet defiance in Denise's eyes, the calculated caution in Charles's demeanor. They weren't here to listen, they were here to protect themselves. Let me make this clear, Elijah said, his voice cutting through the silence. We're not going back to the way things were. If you can't accept that, I suggest you tender your resignations. Denise stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. You're making a mistake, Elijah. This kind of upheaval doesn't end well. It doesn't end well for people who built their careers on deceit. Elijah shot back. For everyone else, it's a chance to start fresh. Denise's jaw tightened, but she said nothing more. She and Charles left the office, their departure heavy with unspoken threats. That evening, as Elijah drove home, the city seemed quieter than usual. The hum of the engine and the glow of passing headlights provided a temporary reprieve from the storm brewing at work. Yet even in this solitude, his mind raced. He thought of Marianne Porter, of her quiet strength, her resilience in the face of hostility. He thought of the passengers she had helped, the lives she had touched with simple acts of kindness. And he thought of the countless others like her, silenced by systems designed to reward conformity over compassion. But Elijah also knew that change would not come easily. The forces arrayed against him were not just individuals like Denise and Charles. They were the entrenched habits of a society that valued power over people. Appearances over substance. When he arrived home, his phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Marianne. "Thank you for standing up for us. But I'm worried. Rebecca and her allies, they're not done fighting." Elijah stared at the words, his chest tightening. He had expected resistance, but Marianne's message carried an undercurrent of fear that unsettled him. This wasn't just about corporate politics anymore, it was personal. The next morning, Elijah arrived at the office to find a folder waiting on his desk. It was unmarked. The contents slipped beneath a heavy black clip. Inside were copies of emails, conversations between Denise, Charles, and several other senior staff members. They spoke in coded language but left little doubt about their intent. They were planning to undermine his reforms. To paint him as impulsive, emotional, and unfit to lead. Elijah felt his pulse quicken. The fight was escalating, the stakes growing higher. If these people succeeded, they wouldn't just undo his work, they would destroy the company's integrity entirely. He picked up the phone and dialed Marianne. When she answered, her voice was cautious but steady. "Marianne," he said, "I need your help." "My help?" she asked, surprised. "I've seen how you handle pressure. How you stand firm even when others try to tear you down. I need someone like that on my side." There was a pause, and Elijah could almost hear her weighing the risks. "What do you need me to do?" she asked finally. Elijah leaned back in his chair, his determination hardening into resolve. "We're going to expose them," he said, "all of them, and we're going to rebuild this company the right way." The battle was far from over. But Elijah knew one thing for certain. The cracks in the foundation were finally visible. And he would do whatever it took to repair them, even if it meant tearing the whole structure down. Elijah Morrison sat at the head of the long, polished table in the executive boardroom, the city skyline stretching out behind him like a silent witness to the battle unfolding within. The room was filled with familiar faces: executives, HR representatives, department heads. And yet, there was an air of quiet hostility, as if alliances had already been formed and lines silently drawn. The morning light cast sharp shadows across the table, a visual reminder of the divide that had begun to consume Morrison Airways. On one side were those who had benefited from the old ways, their expressions tight and guarded. On the other were employees like Marianne Porter, invited to this meeting as a sign of Elijah's commitment to reform. Her presence at the table was itself a challenge to the status quo, a quiet, undeniable assertion that the time for change had come. Elijah surveyed the room, his gaze landing briefly on each face. He could feel the tension, the unspoken accusations hanging heavy in the air. These were not strangers to him. They were colleagues, people he had worked with for years. And yet, as he stared into their eyes, he realized how little he truly knew them. "This meeting," he began, his voice steady but firm, "is about accountability." A murmur rippled through the room. Denise Harding, the HR director, shifted in her seat, her mouth tightening. Charles Wexley leaned back, arms crossed, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. Elijah continued, undeterred. "For years, this company has operated on principles that do not align with our stated values. Favoritism has replaced merit. Compassion has been dismissed as weakness. And worst of all, we have allowed systems of exclusion to persist, systems that disproportionately harm those who don't fit the mold." His words hung in the air, uncomfortably direct. Marianne, seated near the far end of the table, lowered her gaze. She knew she was one of those people Elijah referred to, though he didn't need to say it outright. The room already knew. Charles was the first to speak. "With all due respect, Elijah, I think you're overstating the issue. Yes, there have been challenges, but every organization faces. I'm not overstating anything." Elijah cut him off sharply. "And you know it." Charles's smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of unease. Elijah reached into the folder in front of him and pulled out a stack of documents, sliding them across the table. They were emails, performance reviews, and memos, evidence of the deliberate sabotage that had kept employees like Marianne from advancing. "This," Elijah said, his voice rising, "is what we've become. A company where talent is buried, where voices are silenced, and where decisions are made not on merit, but on favoritism." Denise cleared her throat, her tone defensive. "Elijah, these are isolated incidents. They don't represent the broader culture. They represent the culture perfectly. Elijah snapped. And you've been complicit in maintaining it. The room was silent, the weight of his accusation settling over them like a heavy fog. Marianne's eyes flickered to Elijah, a mixture of gratitude and trepidation in her expression. She had spent years enduring the very culture he was now exposing. And while his words were a vindication, they also carried the risk of retaliation. As if on cue, Denise leaned forward, her voice cold. If you think tearing this down publicly is the solution, you're mistaken. This company needs stability, not a witch hunt. Elijah stared at her, unflinching. What this company needs, he said, is to remember why it exists. To serve people, to empower them, not to exploit or discard them. The room was tense, the air thick with unspoken resentment. But beneath the surface, Elijah could sense something shifting. A few heads nodded subtly. A glimmer of agreement, of hope, in the faces of employees who had long been afraid to speak up. And then, just as the tension seemed poised to snap, the door to the boardroom opened. A young intern stepped in, her face pale. "Mr. Morrison," she said hesitantly, "I think you need to see this." Elijah frowned, rising from his seat. The intern handed him a tablet, her hands trembling slightly. On the screen was an anonymous email sent to the entire executive team. It was a scathing critique of Elijah's leadership, accusing him of acting out of personal bias and destabilizing the company. But what caught his attention most was the tone, sharp, divisive, and filled with coded language that Elijah recognized all too well. The email wasn't just an attack on him. It was an attempt to frame his reforms as reckless and unfounded, a calculated move to sow doubt among the staff and rally resistance against him. Elijah's jaw tightened as he read. The words weren't new to him. They were the same words that had been used to dismiss him in his early career, to undermine his efforts to rise in an industry that rarely made room for people like him. They were the language of exclusion, of quiet, insidious racism disguised as professionalism. He looked up at the room, his expression grim. "This," he said, holding up the tablet, "is what we're fighting against." Charles leaned forward, feigning concern. "Anonymous emails aren't exactly reliable. Elijah, you can't let one message derail." "This isn't just one message," Elijah interrupted. "It's a symptom of the disease. A culture that punishes anyone who challenges the status quo." The room was silent again. But this time, the silence felt different. It was heavy with the weight of realization, of truths that could no longer be ignored. Elijah turned to Marianne, meeting her eyes. "Marianne," he said, "I need you to lead the charge on this. Your voice matters. Your perspective matters. And it's time this company starts listening." Marianne hesitated, the enormity of his request sinking in. She had spent years being ignored, dismissed, and silenced. The idea of stepping into the spotlight, of becoming a target, was terrifying. But as she looked around the room, she saw the faces of people who were watching her, waiting for her to speak. She nodded slowly. "I'll do it," she said, her voice steady, "but I'm going to need your support." "You have it," Elijah said firmly. The meeting ended soon after. But the battle was far from over. As Elijah returned to his office, the anonymous email still fresh in his mind, he knew the fight ahead would be brutal. The forces aligned against him were powerful, entrenched, and unafraid to play dirty. But as he looked out at the city skyline once more, Elijah felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Because for the first time, he wasn't fighting alone, and together, they were ready to face whatever came next. The week that followed was a storm, the kind that began as a quiet wind and grew into a howling gale. For Elijah Morrison, it was a storm he could not afford to ignore. The anonymous email had rippled through Morrison Airways, sparking whispers in the corridors and tension in the break rooms. The senior staff who had thrived under the old system grew bolder, their objections to Elijah's reforms thinly veiled as concerns for stability. Meanwhile, employees like Marianne Porter quietly rallied, their determination to support change tempered by the fear of retaliation. Elijah was no stranger to storms. He had weathered them before in boardrooms, in his personal life, and in the unseen battles that came with walking through a world that questioned his presence in places of power. But this storm felt different. It wasn't just about him, it was about the soul of the company he had built, the people it employed, and the values it claimed to uphold. On Monday morning, Elijah convened a smaller, Private meeting with Marianne and a handful of trusted allies. They gathered in a conference room tucked away from the main offices. Its walls lined with whiteboards and stacks of reports. Marianne sat at the table's edge, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked calm, but Elijah could sense the weight she carried. "I need to know what we're up against," Elijah began, his voice steady but urgent. "Marianne, have you seen or heard anything since the meeting?" Marianne hesitated, then nodded. "There's a group of senior staff, mostly people who were close to Rebecca. They're spreading rumors about you. About me. About the changes you're making." "What kind of rumors?" Elijah asked. "That the reforms are just a PR stunt," Marianne said, her tone tinged with frustration. "That you're using me as a pawn to distract from the company's real problems. They're even saying that you're making this about race." The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. Elijah leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. It wasn't the first time he'd heard such accusations, but it didn't make them sting any less. The implication that his fight for justice was self-serving or that it was divisive was a tactic as old as the struggle itself, a way to deflect attention from the real issue and place the burden of proof on those demanding change. "Let them say what they want," Elijah said finally, his voice low but firm. "The truth is on our side. But we need to be smart about this. They're not going to play fair." Marianne nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "Elijah," she said hesitantly, "there's something else. Someone slipped a note into my locker yesterday. It said, 'Stay in your lane,' no name, no explanation." Elijah's eyes darkened. "Did you report it?" She shook her head. "To who?" "Denise is still in our. And she's part of the problem. Besides, I don't want to seem paranoid." "It's not paranoia," Elijah said. "It's intimidation. And it's unacceptable." He stood and began pacing the room, his mind racing. The anonymous email, the note, the rumors. It was clear the resistance wasn't just passive. It was organized. Whoever was behind it wasn't just trying to undermine him, they were trying to protect their own power. "No matter the cost. Here's what we're going to do," Elijah said, turning back to the group. "We'll conduct an internal investigation. But quietly. I want every email, every meeting, every decision Rebecca's circle made over the past 5 years reviewed. If there's a pattern of favoritism or misconduct, we're going to expose it." Marianne frowned. "Won't that make things worse? If they find out we're investigating them, they'll escalate." Elijah finished. "I know, but they're already escalating. The difference is, we're going to be ready." By midweek, the investigation was underway. Elijah had assigned a trusted team of analysts to comb through the records, their work shrouded in secrecy. But as the days passed, the tension within the company only grew. Meetings became battlegrounds, with senior staff openly challenging Elijah's authority. Anonymous emails continued to circulate, their tone growing more vitriolic. And the whispers about Marianne became louder, their edges sharper. Elijah watched it all unfold, his resolve hardening with each passing day. He knew what they were trying to do. They wanted him to falter, to question himself, to retreat. But retreating wasn't an option, not for him. And certainly not for Marianne. On Thursday afternoon, Elijah received a call from one of the analysts. The voice on the other end was hurried, almost breathless. "Mr. Morrison, we found something." "What is it?" Elijah asked, his heart pounding. "It's an email chain," the analyst said, "between Rebecca and several other senior staff. They were discussing how to block Marianne's promotions. They even talked about erasing her performance reviews from the system." Elijah's grip tightened on the phone. "Send me everything," he said. "Now." Minutes later, the documents arrived in his inbox. As Elijah read through them, his anger grew. The emails were damning, not just proof of favoritism, but evidence of deliberate sabotage. Rebecca and her allies hadn't just ignored Marianne's achievements, they had actively worked to bury them. Elijah forwarded the emails to Marianne with a single line: "You were right. And we're going to fix this." That evening, Elijah called another meeting, this time with the entire executive team. The room was packed, the atmosphere electric with tension. Denise and Charles sat near the center, their expressions carefully neutral. Marianne was there too, seated beside Elijah, her presence a quiet challenge to those who had tried to silence her. Elijah didn't waste time. He projected the emails onto the screen at the front of the room. The words stark and undeniable. "This," he said, his voice ringing out, "is what's been happening behind closed doors. deliberate sabotage, manipulation of records, an abuse of power that has no place in this company. The room erupted into murmurs. Some shocked, others defensive. Denise raised her hand, her voice sharp. These emails don't represent the majority of the staff. You're blowing this out of proportion. I'm addressing the problem, Elijah said coldly. And if you're part of that problem, you're free to leave. Charles leaned forward, his tone calculated. Elijah, you're risking the stability of this company. Is that really worth it? Stability built on corruption isn't stability. Elijah replied. It's a house of cards. And it's time we build something stronger. He turned to Marianne, motioning for her to speak. She stood, her hands trembling slightly but her voice steady. For years, I've been told I wasn't good enough. She said, that I was too soft. Too different. Too everything. And I believed it, because that's what the system is designed to do, to make people like me question our worth. But I'm done questioning, and so are a lot of us. Her words hung in the air, a quiet defiance that left no room for doubt. The meeting ended with no clear resolution. But Elijah knew one thing for certain, the tide was turning. The resistance was fierce, but so was the determination of those fighting for change. And as he left the room that night, Elijah felt a spark of hope. The storm was far from over. But they were no longer standing in it alone. They were building something stronger, something that could withstand the winds. Elijah Morrison's office felt colder than usual as he sat alone, staring at the city below. The skyline, usually a source of inspiration, seemed distant, almost indifferent to the struggles brewing within Morrison Airways. The documents in front of him, the emails, the performance reviews, the notes of sabotage were more than evidence. They were a mirror reflecting the cracks that had been ignored for too long. And in those cracks, he saw a deeper truth about the company he had built. It was as much a product of the world's prejudices as it was of his ambition. A sharp knock on the door broke his thoughts. It was Marianne. Her presence was steady, but Elijah could see the exhaustion etched into her face. They know, she said quietly, closing the door behind her. About the emails, words spreading fast. Elijah nodded. He had expected this. The evidence he had unveiled was too damning to stay contained. Good, he replied. Let them know. They need to understand this isn't going away. Marianne hesitated, then leaned against the desk. Elijah, people are scared. Some of the junior staff have been pulled into meetings with Denise and Charles. They're being pressured to stay quiet. Elijah's expression darkened. Intimidation tactics. He muttered. They're doubling down. Marianne nodded. They're not just trying to protect themselves. They're trying to destroy you. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the battle ahead hung heavy in the room. Elijah's fight for justice had always been personal. But now it was clear that it had become a war, one that would test not only his resolve but the resolve of everyone who stood with him. By midweek, the tension within Morrison Airways had reached a boiling point. The hallways buzzed with whispered conversations, and the usual rhythms of work were disrupted by a palpable undercurrent of unease. Senior staff members like Denise Harding and Charles Wexley were openly defiant, using their influence to sow doubt and resistance among the ranks. It was in this charged atmosphere that Elijah made his next move. He called for a company-wide town hall meeting, inviting employees from all levels to gather in the largest conference room. The announcement sent shockwaves through the organization. Town halls were rare, and one called by the CEO with little notice was unheard of. The room was packed when Elijah entered, accompanied by Marianne and a few key allies. The crowd was a mix of curiosity, apprehension, and defiance. Denise and Charles stood near the back, their expressions unreadable but their presence a silent challenge. Elijah stepped to the podium, his gaze sweeping over the room. Thank you all for being here, he began, his voice calm but firm. I called this meeting because I believe in transparency. And right now, this company is facing a moment of truth. He paused, letting his words settle. The room was silent, the air thick with anticipation. For years, Morrison Airways has operated on a set of values that we claim to uphold: fairness, integrity, and respect. But recent events have made it clear that we haven't always lived up to those values. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. But Elijah continued. I've uncovered evidence of systemic favoritism, deliberate sabotage, and a culture that punishes those who dare to be different. This isn't just about one person or one incident, it's about a pattern that has harmed countless employees and undermined the very principles we stand for. He gestured toward Marianne, who stepped forward, her hands clasped tightly. Marianne Porter is one of those employees, Elijah said. She has dedicated 10 years to this company, going above and beyond for our customers and her colleagues. Yet she was denied opportunity after opportunity, not because she lacked talent, but because she didn't fit the mold. Marianne took a deep breath, then began to speak. Her voice was steady but carried the weight of years of frustration. I stayed quiet for a long time because I thought that's what I had to do. I thought if I worked hard enough, eventually someone would notice. But instead, I was told I was too soft, too different. I was told I didn't belong. Her words hit the room like a thunderclap. Elijah watched as the employees reacted, some nodding in agreement, others shifting uncomfortably. Denise and Charles exchanged glances, their faces pale. Marianne continued, her voice growing stronger. I'm not the only one. There are so many others who've been overlooked, dismissed, or made to feel like they don't belong. And it's not because we aren't capable. It's because the system is designed to keep people like us out. As Marianne stepped back, Elijah returned to the podium. This ends now, he said, his voice rising. We are launching a full audit of our promotion practices, performance reviews, and HR policies. Anyone found to have engaged in discrimination or sabotage will be held accountable. And we will rebuild this company not as it was, but as it should be. The room erupted in applause. But not everyone was clapping. Denise and Charles stood frozen, their faces masks of anger and fear. Elijah met their gaze, his own unwavering. This isn't just about cleaning house, he said, addressing them directly. It's about creating a culture where everyone has a chance to thrive. And if that threatens your position here, then you're part of the problem. The meeting ended with a standing ovation. But Elijah knew the battle wasn't over. As employees filed out, he caught sight of Denise and Charles slipping away, their heads bent together in hushed conversation. They were planning something, he could feel it. That night, Elijah received an anonymous tip. It was a brief message, sent from an untraceable email address. They're going to the board. Watch your back. The words sent a chill through him. Denise and Charles weren't just fighting for their own survival, they were escalating the conflict to the highest levels of the company. If they succeeded in turning the board against him, his reforms could be undone in an instant. Elijah sat alone in his office, the city lights casting long shadows across the room. The storm had reached its peak, and the next move would determine everything. He picked up his phone and dialed Marianne. When she answered, he said only one thing: get ready. We're about to face the fight of our lives. The boardroom at Morrison Airways was a fortress of polished wood, leather chairs, and thick glass that shielded its occupants from the city's chaos below. Yet on this day, the tension inside was palpable, pressing against the walls as though the room itself could feel the gravity of the moment. Elijah Morrison sat at the head of the table, his hands clasped before him, his expression unreadable. Around him sat the 12 members of the board, powerful, affluent, and accustomed to control. At the far end of the table, Denise Harding and Charles Wexley sat together, their faces masks of polite confidence. They had spent the last week quietly lobbying board members, painting Elijah's reforms as reckless and divisive, threatening the stability of the company. And now, they were here to make their case. Elijah scanned the room. Some of the board members met his gaze with neutrality, while others avoided his eyes altogether. He could feel the weight of their skepticism, the whispers they had exchanged behind closed doors. He knew what was at stake, not just his position, but the future of the company and the people it employed. The chair of the board, a silver-haired man named Henry Ashcroft, cleared his throat. Elijah, he began, his voice calm but firm. Thank you for joining us. We've heard concerns from several senior staff members regarding the recent changes you've implemented. They claim these changes have caused disruption and uncertainty within the organization. Elijah nodded, his expression steady. Disruption is inevitable when you're dismantling a broken system. Henry's brows furrowed slightly. Broken, you say? Yes, Elijah replied, leaning forward. For years, this company has operated on a foundation of favoritism, exclusion, and silence. Talented employees have been overlooked, sabotaged, and forced out because they didn't fit a narrow definition of what leadership should look like. If that's not broken, I don't know what is. Charles leaned in, his tone smooth but pointed. With all due respect, Elijah, those are serious accusations. And while no organization is perfect, the measures you've taken, audits, policy overhauls, public dismissals, they've created instability. Employees are uncertain about their future. Investors are growing wary. Elijah's jaw tightened. He had expected this line of attack. Instability comes from the truth being revealed. He said, if our employees and investors are concerned, it's because they're finally seeing the reality of what's been happening here. Denise chimed in, her voice measured. But at what cost? Your actions have alienated senior staff, disrupted operations, and, frankly, jeopardized the company's reputation. Is this really the legacy you want to leave? Elijah's gaze sharpened. My legacy isn't up for debate. What's at stake here is whether this company will live up to its values or continue to hide behind them. And I won't apologize for holding people accountable. The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut. Elijah could feel the weight of the board's eyes on him, their judgment hovering just out of reach. Henry leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. Elijah, he said slowly, we need to consider the bigger picture. Investors are concerned about profitability. Customers are watching closely. How can you assure us that these changes won't harm the company in the long term? Elijah exhaled, his mind racing. He knew he needed to pivot to shift the conversation from risk to opportunity. Henry, he said, his voice steady, let me tell you about two people, Marianne Porter and Samuel Torres. A flicker of curiosity crossed Henry's face. Go on. Marianne Porter has been with this company for 10 years. She's one of the most talented employees we've ever had. But because she didn't fit the mold, she was denied opportunities, her achievements erased, her potential buried. That's the kind of culture we've allowed to thrive, a culture that punishes excellence if it doesn't look the way we expect. He paused, letting the words sink in. And then there's Samuel Torres, a retired firefighter who flew with us after losing his wife. Marianne was the only person who treated him with dignity, who went out of her way to help him. He wrote to me after that flight, saying he'd never felt more valued as a customer. People like Marianne are why we exist, to serve, to care, to make a difference. That's what we're fighting for. The board members exchanged glances, their expressions softening slightly, but Elijah knew it wasn't enough. He needed more. He reached into his bag and pulled out a thick folder, placing it on the table. This, he said, is a collection of emails, performance reviews, and testimonials. It's evidence of the systemic favoritism and sabotage that have harmed this company from within. And it's proof that we can't afford to go back to the way things were. Henry opened the folder, his eyes scanning the pages. The room was silent, the tension mounting as the weight of Elijah's words began to shift the atmosphere. Finally, Henry looked up. And what do you propose we do, Elijah? Elijah straightened, his voice strong. We keep moving forward. We complete the audits. We hold people accountable. And we invest in the people who have been overlooked for too long, people like Marianne. If we do that, we won't just rebuild trust. We'll become a company that others aspire to emulate. Henry nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful, but before he could respond, Denise spoke up, her tone sharp. And if it fails, what then? You'll leave this board to pick up the pieces while you walk away unscathed? Elijah turned to her, his gaze unyielding. If it fails, I'll take full responsibility. But I don't believe it will. Because people want to believe in something better. They want to work for a company that values them, not just their output. And I believe this board wants the same. The room was quiet, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. Finally, Henry spoke. We'll take a vote. The board members cast their votes. One by one, Elijah's heart pounded as he watched the tally. Each, aye, or nay, a step closer to the decision that would define the future of Morrison Airways. When the final vote was cast, Henry turned to Elijah, his expression unreadable. The board has decided, he said. We will support your reforms. Relief flooded through Elijah, but it was tempered by the knowledge that the fight was far from over. Denise and Charles sat in stony silence, their defeat evident but their resolve unbroken. They would not give up easily. As the meeting adjourned, Elijah stood, his shoulders heavy but his spirit unyielding. He had won this battle. But the war for the soul of Morrison Airways was just beginning. And he was ready for whatever came next. The aftermath of the board's decision was not the victory it seemed on the surface. Elijah Morrison had won their support for his reforms. But the triumph felt fragile, as if it could be undone with a single misstep. The cracks in Morrison Airways' foundation were not just structural, they were cultural. Deeply embedded in years of silent complicity and deliberate oversight. The office buzzed with an uneasy energy in the days following the vote. Employees whispered in corners, their conversations shadowed by uncertainty. Some celebrated the promise of change, while others, particularly those who had thrived under the old regime, watched with cold, calculating eyes. Elijah knew they were waiting for him to fail. The resistance was quieter now, but no less insidious. Anonymous emails continued to circulate, spreading rumors and half-truths about his leadership. Complaints began to surface, small, almost petty grievances that, when piled together, created a narrative of discontent. It was clear that Denise Harding and Charles Wexley, though stripped of their immediate influence, were still pulling strings behind the scenes. And then, late one evening, a bombshell landed on Elijah's desk. Marianne Porter, now officially head of passenger experience, had been leading a team tasked with reviewing employee grievances filed over the past 5 years. Among the complaints, she found a pattern that chilled her: repeated reports of racial bias in promotions, disciplinary actions, and customer interactions. The grievances had been dismissed or buried by hour, their voices silenced before they could reach the surface. When Marianne handed Elijah the file, her hands trembled. "This is worse than I thought," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Elijah flipped through the pages, his stomach tightening with each line. The reports were damning. A black flight attendant reprimanded for minor infractions while her white colleagues were excused for similar behavior. A Latino ground crew member denied a promotion despite glowing reviews. A South Asian customer service agent forced to endure racist remarks from a supervisor without recourse. Elijah closed the file and leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. This wasn't just about favoritism or sabotage anymore. This was systemic discrimination, and it was happening under his watch. "We need to act," Marianne said, her voice steady but urgent. "We can't ignore this." Elijah nodded, his resolve hardening. "We won't, but this isn't just a policy issue. It's a cultural one, and fixing it is going to take more than audits and training." Marianne met his gaze, her expression determined. "What do we do?" Elijah thought for a moment, then stood. "We shine a light on it. No more silence. No more secrets." The following morning, Elijah called for another town hall meeting. This one was different from the first. It wasn't just for employees, it was for everyone: staff, executives, board members, even the media. If Morrison Airways was going to confront its demons, it would do so in full view of the world. The room was packed when Elijah took the stage, his voice calm but firm as he addressed the crowd. "Over the past few weeks, we've talked a lot about accountability, about facing the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it is. Today, I want to share one of those truths." He gestured to the screen behind him, where a presentation began to play. It displayed excerpts from the grievances Marianne had uncovered, redacted to protect identities but detailed enough to convey the depth of the issue. "These are the voices of our employees," Elijah said, voices that were ignored, silenced, or dismissed. They spoke out about discrimination, about bias, about being treated as less than. And instead of listening, we failed them. The room was silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Elijah continued, his voice rising. "This isn't just a problem for our. It's not just a problem for management. It's a problem for all of us. Because when we allow this kind of behavior to persist, we're saying it's okay. We're saying it's acceptable. And it's not." He paused, scanning the crowd. "Change starts with acknowledgement. So today, I'm acknowledging our failure, and I'm committing to doing better." Marianne stepped forward then, her presence calm but commanding. "We're launching a comprehensive review of all grievance processes," she announced. "Every complaint that was ignored will be revisited. Every employee who was silenced will have a chance to speak. And we will not stop until we've rebuilt trust." The crowd erupted into applause. But Elijah could see the unease in the faces of some senior staff. They knew what this meant: scrutiny, accountability, and, for some, consequences. That evening, as Elijah sat in his office, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was short but chilling. "You're making enemies. Watch your back." Elijah stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. He had known the road ahead would be treacherous. But this was a reminder of just how far some people were willing to go to protect their power. The storm was far from over. But as Elijah looked out at the city lights, he felt a quiet determination rise within him. This fight wasn't just about Morrison Airways anymore. It was about something bigger, about justice, about dignity, about refusing to let the voices of the silenced be ignored. And for that, Elijah was willing to risk everything. The air in Morrison Airways headquarters was charged with a tension so thick it felt almost physical. The town hall had sent shockwaves through the company, and the once muted grumblings of dissent had turned into a full-blown storm. For Elijah Morrison, the days that followed were a blur of meetings, confrontations, and quiet threats that came not with raised voices but with the subtle maneuvering of those desperate to maintain their grip on power. The anonymous threats continued, growing more pointed. A note slipped under Elijah's office door read, "You're taking this too far." Another message, scrawled hastily on a whiteboard in the break room, declared, "Reform won't save you." The resistance wasn't just simmering now, it was boiling over. But it wasn't just the threats. It was the quiet sabotage that unnerved Elijah most. Critical emails went missing. Meetings were rescheduled without his knowledge. Decisions he'd made were reversed by middle managers emboldened by the growing chaos. It was as though the company's very fabric was fraying, and the forces pulling at the threads were working overtime. One afternoon, Marianne Porter burst into Elijah's office, her face pale, her expression a mix of anger and fear. She held a folder in her hands. The edges crumpled from her tight grip. "They've escalated," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "What happened?" Elijah asked, his stomach sinking. Marianne handed him the folder. Inside were copies of complaints filed by employees, complaints that had mysteriously resurfaced, altered to include false accusations. In some cases, the altered documents implicated Marianne herself, suggesting that she had mishandled sensitive issues or failed to act on reports of misconduct. "They're trying to discredit me," Marianne said, her voice breaking slightly. "And if they succeed, they won't." Elijah interrupted, his voice firm. "We'll prove this is fabricated." But Marianne shook her head. "This isn't just about me, Elijah. They're using me to get to you. They want to show the board that your reforms are a liability, that you can't control your own team." Elijah leaned back in his chair, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had known this fight would be hard, but he hadn't expected it to become so personal, so ruthless. "Marianne," he said after a moment, "you've stood tall through all of this. Don't let them break you now." Marianne nodded, but her eyes betrayed the exhaustion she felt. "I won't," she said quietly, "but we need to hit back." That evening, Elijah called an emergency meeting with his closest allies, Marianne, a few trusted executives, and a small team of legal and PR advisors. They gathered in a secure conference room, the tension palpable. "We're at a breaking point," Elijah began, his voice steady but grave. "The resistance isn't just about preserving the old ways anymore. It's about destroying everything we're trying to build. And if we don't act decisively, they'll win." The room was silent as Elijah laid out the plan. They would launch a full-scale investigation into the altered complaints, leveraging the company's cybersecurity team to trace the origins of the changes. At the same time, they would release a public statement reaffirming their commitment to reform and calling out the sabotage for what it was. But the most critical part of the plan was the audit. Elijah had ordered a comprehensive review of every decision made by the senior staff over the past decade. It was a risky move, one that could expose even more systemic issues. But Elijah knew it was the only way to root out the corruption. "This won't be easy," he said, his gaze sweeping over the room. "But if we don't do this, we lose everything, not just our credibility, but the trust of the people who believe in what we're trying to do." Marianne spoke up then, her voice strong despite the strain. "It's worth the risk," she said, "because if we back down now, they'll see it as a victory. And they'll use it to keep silencing people like me, like the employees who've been ignored for years." The room nodded in agreement, the weight of the decision settling over them. The days that followed were a whirlwind. The cybersecurity team uncovered evidence that the altered complaints had been fabricated by a small group of senior staff loyalists to Denise and Charles. The evidence was damning, and Elijah wasted no time presenting it to the board. The confrontation was heated. Denise and Charles denied the allegations, claiming they were the targets of a smear campaign. But the evidence was irrefutable. Emails, timestamps, and even witnessed testimony from a whistleblower who had come forward after the town hall. By the end of the meeting, the board voted unanimously to terminate Denise and Charles, along with the staff members implicated in the sabotage. It was a victory, but it came at a cost. The fallout was immediate. News of the termination spread quickly, and the media seized on the story, framing it as a company in crisis. Employees were divided. Some celebrated the accountability, while others saw it as proof of instability. Investors began to waver, their confidence shaken by the public spectacle. Elijah knew the fight was far from over. The reforms were still fragile, and the trust he was trying to rebuild was tenuous at best. But as he sat in his office that night, reviewing the latest reports, he felt a quiet determination settle over him. The storm had reached its peak, and the damage was significant. But in the wreckage, there was also opportunity, a chance to rebuild something stronger, something better. And for the first time in weeks, Elijah allowed himself a small, hopeful smile, because no matter how fierce the resistance, he knew one thing for certain: the truth was on his side. And the truth had a way of enduring, even in the face of the fiercest storms. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Morrison Airways headquarters, casting long shadows across the boardroom table. Elijah Morrison sat at the head of it, his hands folded, his gaze steady. Around him, the room was filled with senior executives, department heads, and board members, some allies, others skeptics. The atmosphere was heavy, charged with the anticipation of what was to come. The storm that had consumed the company in recent weeks had finally broken, leaving in its wake a battered but standing foundation. The terminations of Denise Harding, Charles Wexley, and their inner circle had sent shockwaves through the company, shaking loose years of entrenched power dynamics. But it had also left a void, one that needed to be filled with something stronger, something that could withstand the pressures of rebuilding. Elijah stood, the room falling silent as he began to speak. For weeks, we've been fighting a battle not just against individuals, but against a culture that's allowed favoritism, exclusion, and silence to thrive. It's been painful, it's been messy, and it's far from over. He paused, letting his words settle. But today, we take the next step. Today, we begin to rebuild not just this company, but the trust we've lost, the trust of our employees, our customers, and ourselves. The room was silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Then Marianne Porter rose, standing at Elijah's side. She wore a simple but sharp suit, her presence radiating quiet strength. It was a far cry from the woman who had once been told she was too soft, too different, too unfit for leadership. Over the past few weeks, she began, her voice calm but firm. We've uncovered truths that were long buried. We've seen the harm that silence and complicity can cause. And we've felt the weight of resistance from those who would rather see this company fall than see it change. She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. But we've also seen something else. We've seen courage. We've seen employees, flight attendants, ground crew, customer service agents speak up for the first time. We've seen a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths, to do the hard work of change. And that gives me hope. The room remained silent, but there was a shift, subtle but undeniable. Heads nodded, faces softened. The tension that had gripped the room began to loosen. Elijah took a step forward, his voice rising. This is our moment, not just to fix what's broken, but to build something better. A company where every employee feels valued, where every passenger feels seen, where integrity isn't just a slogan, it's a way of life. He turned to Marianne. And that's why I'm announcing a new leadership structure. One that reflects the values we want to uphold. Effective immediately, Marianne Porter will serve as our Chief Experience Officer, overseeing all aspects of employee and customer engagement. The room erupted into applause, genuine, unforced, and filled with a sense of renewal. Marianne's cheeks flushed, but she stood tall, her eyes meeting Elijah's with a mixture of gratitude and determination. But Elijah wasn't finished. He held up a folder, its contents thick with papers. This, he said, is the blueprint for our future. A roadmap for the reforms we're implementing. Transparent hiring and promotion practices. Comprehensive bias training. A grievance process that ensures every voice is heard. And, most importantly, a commitment to holding ourselves accountable at every level. The applause grew louder, but Elijah raised a hand, quieting the room. His tone shifted, growing softer but no less resolute. I won't pretend this will be easy, he said. Change never is. There will be setbacks. There will be resistance. But we've come too far to turn back now. His voice rose again, filled with the fire that had carried him through the darkest moments of this fight. We owe it to ourselves. We owe it to the people who've been silenced. And we owe it to the next generation, so they inherit something better than what we've been. The room erupted once more, the applause mingling with cheers and murmurs of agreement. For the first time in weeks, the atmosphere felt lighter, not free of tension, but filled with a sense of purpose. Later that evening, as the building emptied and the city outside glowed with twilight, Elijah stood by the window of his office. Marianne joined him, holding 2 mugs of coffee. She handed one to him, then leaned against the window ledge. Do you think it'll work? She asked quietly. Elijah sipped his coffee, his gaze distant. I think it has to. Marianne nodded, her expression thoughtful. I used to think change was impossible here. She admitted that no matter how hard I worked, nothing would ever really change. And now? Elijah asked, turning to her. She smiled faintly. Now I think, maybe it's worth trying. Elijah chuckled softly, raising his mug in a quiet toast. To trying. Marianne clinked her mug against his, her smile growing. To trying. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the city lights flicker against the encroaching darkness. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, the horizon felt clear. It wasn't the end of the story, just the beginning of a new chapter. And for Elijah Morrison, that was more than enough.